So let us go to these travel issues. I get this question all the time in two different extremes. One is my clients are trying to develop business travel policies to decide what they're going to do. Generally folks are trying to discourage business travel, but there are some things that need to take place in person, although I know Lex and I think that this platform works pretty well. The other extreme questions that I get is, I'm laughing, I've had some clients where they have a few employees who are very excited about all the discount air travel to Las Vegas and hotel room discounts, and are doing some travel out of state. I've even had a client where one of their employees' family was getting married in Phoenix, and so the employee was traveling to Arizona frequently, particularly in the peak of one of Arizona's outbreaks, and that was causing concern. So unfortunately, we don't have much other than guidance from the CDC about how to travel safe and what precautions to take. So these were all updated. I've given you the links here. You've got the general landing page, the precautions for travel, and the FAQs. If you have business travelers for your work, or if you even know employees are traveling, or even if you don't, this is another great time to communicate with your workforce about what the guidelines are about intrastate and interstate travel. So that's travel within the state of Washington or travel outside the state. The first question I get when this comes up is, well, can I just prohibit employees from traveling? So you certainly can prohibit employees from business travel because you're just not going to approve it and set it up. But can you prohibit employees from flying to Las Vegas to play in the blackjack tournament? So probably not, even in the state of Washington. Now, some states, like Colorado is one of them, actually have specific prohibitions that would prevent an employer from banning off-duty lawful conduct. We're not quite that extreme. Isn't that funny that Washington doesn't have that yet, but we don't. However, we have some public policy considerations. So telling an employee that they can't go to Las Vegas is probably not a good idea for purposes of this webinar. However, you can require employees to tell you about past or future travel plans. And in fact, you should. You need to be able to evaluate that risk. So back to the question about the pre-shift screening questionnaire, some of my clients include a question on there about recent travel in the past 14 days, for example. And if you know an employee has traveled, you definitely at a minimum want to monitor them for symptoms. In fact, you can require that they self-monitor for symptoms and fill something out every day. Let's say you decide to not do a pre-symptom check questionnaire for everybody, but you could do it for the folks who have told you that they've been to Las Vegas or Arizona, or it used to be New York, or down to a Florida beach. What are the quarantine guidelines if somebody travels? Well, I said here, I sure wish somebody would give them to us, but we don't have really any clear direction. Now, I think part of this is that we've seen a lack of advice and cohesiveness at the federal level, so it's been left to the various states, and I think this is one of those things. So for Washington State, for example, we currently have no quarantine requirements upon travel to our state, which would also apply to somebody going out of state and coming back, but like Florida does. So if you were in Florida and you left Florida and you came back to Florida, you could actually require your employee to quarantine for the period that is currently under the travel guidelines. Washington doesn't have that, so we don't have that here that would kind of give us some helpful. We do have that the CDC says all travelers should avoid non-essential international travel. I think you could be a little bit more firm with your employees about that. If somebody says they're, flying to, I don't know where, Morocco, France, Japan, China, anywhere, perhaps that's something that you're going to discourage, although I'm not sure you can prevent it. So what do? Well, you're probably going to have to follow the symptomatic, asymptomatic guidelines. And as I've said here on the slide, though, the CDC isn't giving us much for somebody who's traveled and they're asymptomatic. They're just telling us the usual, that employees should maintain social distance of 6 feet or more. They should wear a mask. They should wash their hands. They shouldn't sneeze on people. It's really not helpful, so it's going to be up to you. I put a lot of questions with hotspot here because the CDC didn't really give us any different guidelines other than to say hotspots are more dangerous. All right, so what do you want to do is really what this is going to come down to, and what makes sense for your business. So we need to talk about leave and also requiring testing. So if an employee particularly says they've been off to their family's wedding in Arizona for several weeks now, could you require them to take a test before they come back to work? Yes, you could. You have that right. There's a couple things I want to point out, though. Remember, if they're just having a viral test, it's up to a 14-day incubation period. So having somebody test the day after they got back from Arizona, have them be clear, and have them come back to the workplace 3 days later actually isn't going to catch if they have the virus. That's number one. Harvard has a study out, if you Google it, you can find it, that says it probably takes 3 to 5 days typically for symptoms to start to show. So that would be 3 to 5 days from exposure. That's typical, but the incubation period is still up to 2 weeks. Then the next question I get is, well, what if I have that employee go do an antibody test? I should be able to know even more definitively if they've had it or not. Again, that isn't going to be an immediate answer. The CDC says it's 1 to 3 weeks to even start creating antibodies. And I've given you the page here that'll take you to that. The last point on this slide is, whatever your rule is, it has to be the same for all employees. That's for lots of reasons. I don't want you to end up in a situation where you're only testing women and not men, or only testing people of color and not white, your white employees. But the idea is too, it also is just fundamental fairness. So it should be any out-of-state travel, you're going to have this list of guidelines, and it's probably something you need to think about.
I have a question. I have a question related to travel from an anonymous user here. What if an employee was told by their healthcare provider to quarantine, but uses that time as vacation instead?
So I presume that the employer has allowed for paid leave or put in for FCRA leave or Washington State paid leave because of the healthcare provider recommendation. I think that I'm not going to give a definitive answer because this is getting into legal issues. Generally, I can tell you, though, here's what I spot. If you have evidence that the employee is doing something fraudulent, or if you have evidence, for example, that the employee was supposed to stay home and self-isolate, but I don't know, now they're playing soccer and going to family reunions and not wearing a mask and running around. Because Washington State doesn't have that off-duty conduct law, you may be looking at a situation where you could terminate somebody, but I am never going to give a recommendation about whether it's okay to terminate somebody in a webinar. There's so much more that I don't know. Plus, you want it to be attorney-client privileged, so that we all don't have to testify at the lawsuit. I know that you said anonymous, but that still could be a concern. So that one's really one to reach out to your lawyer about. Certainly, I'm not happy to hear that that could be a possibility, and people who abuse their leave rights is one of my pet peeves. All right, so let's say we have this employee who comes back from Arizona and we want to have them quarantined for 14 days. Again, you could require them to do that, but we're going to get into a situation where they might not get paid for that 2 weeks, depending on what you decide to do. So without a doctor's directive, they're not going to qualify for FCRA. We've talked about that multiple times today. Although we're going to encourage that employee to talk to their doctor, and maybe they'll end up with the directive so we could offer that leave. Somebody who's just quarantined because they came back from travel or you asked them to is also probably not eligible under Washington state paid sick leave, in the sense that you have to make it available to the employee. There's also no requirement that you have to make PTO or vacation available to the employee. But there's one but, and there's that I said on the slide, and another but that I'm going to tell you. If you want to make employees' vacation available to them while they're in this quarantine period, you certainly could. Same with Washington state paid sick leave. Where you would get into trouble is if you thought you were going to be able to claim sick leave for that period, because you're probably not going to qualify for the tax credit. Now, the other but I have on here is something more subtle that you need to talk to your lawyer about, which is if you start to view somebody as disabled, even if they're not disabled, you can actually get a disability discrimination claim. That's going to be really fact dependent. But I dealt with this with the swine flu years ago. And we may actually be in a situation where your lawyer would recommend that you offer paid time off. So I know this feels like you're rewarding somebody who took a vacation that wasn't so sensible with another vacation. But in the end, you're trying to protect your workforce from getting sick. And so, maybe that's something that you choose to do. Okay, I'm going to pause here because we're going to get off travel. I want to talk about high-risk workers a little bit. Are there any more questions about travel?
Somewhat related. Susan has a poster with guidelines on when you can and can't work. The first example is that the employee has a household member who's diagnosed ill but aren't showing symptoms. The poster says the employee can work in that situation. As an employer, Susan has, in a restaurant, she's uncomfortable with this. What is your advice?
I don't know where that poster came from, so I can't really comment on it.
BFHD is, I've never heard of them, but.
I don't know. I can tell you that it may be out of date.
Okay.
So the CDC guidelines that we've talked about today have just been updated. If you go to, and it also depends on the county, so it may be a good idea to find out where that poster came from and talk about if it's up to date or not.
She said Benton Franklin Health District.
I don't know when Benton Franklin has updated that.
Yeah, so check on when that was updated, Susan.
Yeah. I think the first thing to start is to look at the CDC and then also call the health department. Okay. And look, just because it says may doesn't mean you have to. So particularly, I'm going to talk as a business owner. If I were a business owner and my head server came and told me that their sister had COVID, I would absolutely send them home to get a test. And I would tell them to call their doctor, and I would probably get their doctor to say that they should stay home and have a test. And if they didn't come back with symptoms, then they get to come back to work earlier. And I've had directives where it's not necessarily 14 days, it's a shorter period, and you have a negative test. So you can reach out to not just the health department, but encourage the employee to get some medical advice there that might guide you through this. But yeah, the biggest thing is to check to see if that poster might be out of date. These things change every day.